So I guess we're about ready to begin. So thank you for all for coming. Thank you, Lars Jonung, for being here all the way from wherever you are across the ocean. And he's visiting here through May 8th. So strike up a conversation if things get on your mind. He's a senior professor at Lund University, served as chairman of the Swedish Policy Council, former research advisor at European Commission, professor at Stockholm University, economics, chief economic advisor to the Prime Minister Carl Bildt, from UCLA, as some of us know quite well. The title, this is a great title, The First Practical Guide to Price Level Stabilization. Confidential report to the Riksbank in 1931 by Cassel, Davidson, and Heckscher. So thank you for coming. Thank you so much. We have so much to learn from you.
Thank you for this introduction. To set your mind in the right direction, I would like to start with a question. Who is the most influential economist today regarding monetary policy? And you have a choice between three economists. First, an Englishman, John Maynard Keynes. And his theory is not the guide for modern central banking. And then you have an American in the center with a Hoover connection and is in his red Adam Smith tie, Milton Friedman. He proposed monetary targeting that has been tried and it's failed. So we are left by default with a third man. Who's he?
John Taylor.
Provincial.
Cassel.
Not Cassel. He is Knut Wicksell. And let's see now how this works. It's good. There we are. It's Knut Wicksell. And he presented,
That's what I said.
in 1898, a theory called the cumulative process today. And this is the theory of modern central banking. It's a theory behind inflation targeting. And Wicksell started with an institutional framework, with an independent central bank, a paper standard, floating exchange rates, and a pure credit economy. No cash, no notes, no coins, no gold. It was basically all transactions were carried out by bookkeeping transactions. And to him, the goal of monetary policy should be a constant rate of inflation, a constant price level. And the main instrument was the policy rate of the central bank. So today, Wicksell is the father of inflation targeting. And in the 1930s, Wicksell was the father of price level stabilization. And here's a picture taken in 1909 by Knut Wicksell. He was professor in Lund, and he published in 1898 Geldzinsen und Güterpreise. That was translated in 1936 as interest and prices. And Wicksell exerted a fundamental influence on Swedish monetary theory and policy. And my whole talk will actually deal with the heritage of Knut. When Sweden left the gold standard on September 27th, 1931, 1 week after the Bank of England taken the same step, the Swedish government, through the Minister of Finance, Felix Hamrin, declared the aim of Swedish monetary policy should be to stabilize the domestic purchasing power of the Swedish krona with available means. With this step, Sweden became the first country, and so far the only country, with an explicit goal for monetary policy set up in this route. And the Riksbank was uncertain. How do we carry out this monetary program? So they contacted three economists, Gustav Cassel, Davidson, and Eli Heckscher, with a questionnaire mailed on October 9, 1931. This questionnaire started a process involving 7 key economists, and I'm going to introduce them to you. First of all, Gustav Cassel. He was a world-famous economist in the 1920s. He competed with Keynes on the #1 position. He was the advisor to the League of Nations. He was known today for the purchasing power parity theory. He published many op-eds, and Cassel, I found out, he wrote the declaration of 1931 for the Ministry of Finance, the day before Sweden left the gold standard. And Cassel writes in his autobiography, the Ministry of Finance never gave me a thank you for my work. The other actor was Davidson. He was the founder and owner and editor of Economics Tidskrifts, the magazine of economics, a very important magazine in Swedish thought, economic thought. Since 1899, until the death of Wicksell, Davidson and Wicksell argued about the proper rule for monetary policy. Wicksell suggested price level stabilization. Davidson said, that's wrong. The price level should move in inverse proportion to growth or changes in productivity. And actually, Davidson's norm was written into the monetary program of Sweden in 1944. He was the oldest among the economists. Then we have Eli Heckscher, an extremely hardworking and productive economic historian, economist, and policy advisor. He's known to most of you today for the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem of international trade. You'll find that in any undergraduate textbook in international economics, and his work on mercantilism. And then you have Erik Lindahl. He wrote his thesis in 1919 on Lindahl pricing of public goods, and you find his work in any major textbook in public economics. He was inspired by Wicksell and Davidson, and he published 2 books on monetary policy in the 1920s. He was an advisor to the Riksbank and devoted advocate of price level stabilization. And then we have a young man, Dag Hammarskjöld. He worked on a thesis on business cycle fluctuations in the 1930s. He was recruited by Heckscher to construct the new consumer price index of the Riksbank in 1931. He became Secretary General to the United Nations and died in Congo. He got the Nobel Peace Prize posthumously. He was young, 26 years old in October 1931. And then we have Ivar Roth, the manager of the Riksbank. He resigned in 1948 in protest against the policy of low interest rates required by the Labour government. He then turned to be the managing director of the IMF, 1951 to 1955. Then there are 2 young economists, Gunnar Myrdal, student of Cassel. He wrote his thesis in 1927, inspired by Wicksell. He was a socialist planner and institutionalist. He published An American Dilemma on the race problem in the United States in 1944, and Asian Drama in 1963. They were basically applications of Knut Wicksell's cumulative process on social behavior. He was known for his great self-esteem. At the breakfast in the 1930s with his 3 kids and Alba, his wife, he could say, there has been 3 great economists in the history of the world. The other 2 are Adam Smith and Karl Marx. There are many other stories, but I won't take them up. He shared the Nobel Prize with Hayek in 1974. And that's an amazing sharing of the prize because they were the opposite of each other. And then we have Bertil Ohlin. He was a student of Cassel and Heckscher. His thesis from 1924 on international trade, you find that one in the undergraduate textbooks in international economics. He became famous for his debate with Keynes in 1929 on German reparations. And Keynes invited him to write a review of general theory in Economic Journal in 1937. And Ohlin used this opportunity to present the Stockholm School of Macroeconomics, arguing that this was actually ahead and more advanced than Keynes' general theory. He got the Nobel Prize in 1917. So here you have this unique group of economists, and I'm claiming that no other country had a similar setup of economists working on price level stabilization on monetary rules in the 1930s. Please challenge me if you find a better example.
Are we open for discussion?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
I would submit that Irving Fisher
Irving Fisher.
Irving Fisher should be considered
Yes,
very prominent in this set.
I will. He was the only one who the Swedes respected in this case. And he inspired Lindahl. And he was, I will mention in his work, he praised the Swedish experiment. But he was an exception, I would claim.
An exception that proves the rule.
Well, yes.
Henry Simons.
He had,
Simons wrote, what, maybe a little bit later.
yeah, he was later. And he was much later, 10 years later, me at least.
1936.
Why was price level stabilization adopted in 1931? And why were the economists involved? I mean, that's the question we should ask first. Why was Sweden the only country in the world that left the gold standard and replaced the gold standard with another policy rule? And the answer is can be found in, say, 4 developments. Knut Wicksell's rule of 1898, the inflation and deflation of World War I, Lindahl's 2 books on rules and instruments for monetary policy, and the public standing of the economics profession. Wicksell presented his idea of price level stabilization for the first time in 1898. And the first sentence was this one: there's no need to waste words proving how important it is that the general level of commodity prices remain as stable and constant as possible. And he presented his cumulative process where the interest rate gap, the gap between the bank rate and the natural rate, are the key concepts. As soon as there's no gap, the price level is constant. So that was the way to control the price level. And the last sentence of his talk is very optimistic. He says, when the practical men of affairs understand my rule, it will be adopted worldwide for the benefit of world commerce. It took about 100 years for Wicksell's rule to be adopted worldwide. Then Sweden was on gold until 1914, when World War I broke out. And the high inflation during World War I started a lively policy debate. Wicksell argued, when the rate of inflation in Sweden was around 40–50%, that Sweden should return to the price level of 1914 through deflation. This was a question of justice. And Heckscher heard this and he said, it was like driving over a pedestrian with a car, and to undo the damage, you back up again. And this didn't stop Wicksell from continuing all the time to say that we should now set up a bureaucracy, an authority that goes through every transaction during the inflation and adjusts so you can get back to a just case. Yes.
Why did Sweden have inflation in World War I? I mean, it was
Because
neutral, right?
we provided the German and the Allied armies with wood, iron ore, pigs, everything.
And you didn't take anything. And you took.
We got lots of claims on Germany that were just wiped out by hyperinflation.
Right, and they got rich. And the same thing happened in World War II. And that's why Sweden was the richest country, because they didn't fight the war and they just made money. Yeah, and they imported.
I mean, if you don't have to spend money for a war, usually you don't have inflation.
No, but
Well, you had it.
it's an open
To the surprise of everyone. And Wicksell was very consistent. Just raise the discount rate to the Riksbank, and you will get stable prices. So anyway, we had 40% inflation, and the decision by the policymakers was go back to gold. And they went back to gold, and you can see the rate of unemployment increased very sharply. We had a higher unemployment in the 1920s than in the 1930s. And the lesson from this experience was high deflation causes high unemployment. And you can see that in the answers given by the economists in the 1930s. Don't try deflation again. And then Erik Lindahl developed in 2 books the message from Wicksell. His first book was on monetary rules, and he started the book by saying, we have to have 2 fundamental principles for rational monetary policy. First of all, a rule must be adopted, and it should be anchored in the Constitution, in the legal framework. And second, The rule should be designed so it creates a minimum of deviations between the actual and intended outcome of nominal contracts. And Lindahl preferred Davidson's rule. He was a student of Wicksell, but he had to give up his attention, the Wicksell approach. And the final chapter was called Stable Exchange Rate or Stable Price Level. He dealt with the monetary rules for an open economy. And here he said that comparing a price level rule with the gold standard, the main result is that free currencies with fluctuating flexible exchange rates stand out as the ideal for the monetary system of the future. That was his final sentence. A few years later, Lindahl published a book on the instruments to be applied under a monetary rule. And here he made a distinction between perfect foresight, that was a term he used. Under perfect foresight, it's sufficient for the central bank to establish and announce the rule. Expectations will then automatically follow the rule. So there's no problem. But this is an uninteresting theoretical case. I mean, you recognize this as rational expectations. And well, some of you may have be as wise as Lindahl and given up on rational expectations, but there are still many around. Then the other case was imperfect foresight. How should monetary policy be designed when expectations are not perfect? He had 4 messages here. First of all, the central bank should start a policy of, they call publicity. The central bank should clearly announce every measure and what are the intended consequences of the measure that it takes. That is to influence expectations. The second message was that the management of the central bank should have a fully secured employment. It could not be fired unless the central bank manager does not follow the rule. That would be the only reason to fire him or her. And then he also discussed the practical aspects of monetary policy under a rule. We cannot expect the central bank to hit the price index perfectly. There has to be a margin of error of a few percentage points. And the margin of error should be designed so the long-run pattern of the price level follows the rule. I mean, you recognize this as a discussion of tolerance bands. So Lindahl was the first economist who discussed the role of a tolerance band. And finally, the short-term rate should be the main policy rate, and the long-term interest rate could be influenced by open market operations. So this was written in the 1920s. And it's like, I would claim, this is 60 years before all the work you've had on inflation targeting. I mean, Lindahl and the Swedes, they were pioneers. Oh, John, so sorry.
Yeah, and he's got forward guidance in there too on number 1. But you characterize this, I'm one of those antediluvians who still like rational expectations. Yeah. And this seems not so much like a rational expectations as a credibility of the central bank. Yeah. You can make all the announcements you want. In fact, it isn't that it's in fact, it's quite rational not to believe central bankers when they make promises. And then you have a sequence of institutions designed to make things credible, as opposed to just we announce it and then it happens.
That's right. Lindahl said in the text, we have to make a distinction between a weak central bank and a strong central bank. And a weak central bank, I'm using his adjective, is a central bank that has no credibility. It should just shut up, because any statement by a weak central bank would induce a political process undermining the rule. So he dealt with that. Unfortunately, his 2 books in Swedish in the 1920s are not fully translated into his book of 1939. So you can't find it in the English text. So another reason why Sweden got price level targeting was that was the exceptional standing of the economics profession. They were household names in the Swedish society. Wicksell published about 450 articles on anything, mostly on money. And my wife and I found 100 unpublished manuscripts in his archive. So we republished them 75 years after his death. Cassel wrote about 1,500 papers, Heckscher 300, Ullin 2,000. They took part in government investigations. They were established as the most important profession. So this explains why Sweden got price level stabilization and why they were approached by.
Well, in 1931, was there a public debt or was there no debt?
There was no debt.
No debt.
No debt to talk about. Yeah.
So Lars, what about the politics of the time and the issues of redistribution, right? Because this is a period when social democracy is really growing in Sweden, right?
Yep.
And so, I mean, these issues of redistribution and, you follow a rule, you're going to end up with unemployment. So how did this discussion play into the political debate? Because you're giving the impression that these really smart technocrats came along and they did this and everybody said, fine.
I'll come to that later.
Okay.
Because that was an issue that Myrdal dealt with, and an issue that was emerging with unemployment. But Sweden in 1931 hadn't got unemployment yet. And we didn't have the kind of tensions like in England and France, where they had to deal with the public debt of World War I. So we were lucky. So how did I get hold?
These
Yeah.
numerous publications, were they like op-eds or were they technical economics?
There were no technical economics at that time. They were op-eds in the newspapers, but then they wrote in Economisk Tidskrift. They published in Economic Journal. Heckscher and Cassel and Ullin were friends with Keynes, who was the editor of Economic Journal. So they published on a very broad front. And they wrote, of course, in Swedish. That's a problem. I once asked you, why didn't you publish your stuff in English? He gave me an answer. It would take too much time to read the proofs. And, well, I think he regretted it because that was a problem for the Swedes. They didn't present much of their message to the English or the German-speaking world. Okay, how did I get hold of these documents? Well, my story starts as a graduate student at UCLA in 1969 to 71. I had Axel Leijonhufvud as my thesis advisor, and he encouraged me to write in Friedman's spirit a thesis on the monetary history of Sweden. So I went back to Sweden. I had a meeting with the head of the Riksbank. I asked him for help. Can I get data from you? Can I get access to the archive? He was very kind, but I made a mistake. I told him I'm inspired by Milton Friedman. And he just, became very upset. The meeting was cut short. I was sent to the Human Resource Department if I wanted any help. It turned out that he strongly disliked Milton Friedman. The story doesn't stop there, because Per Åsbrink, he single-handedly practically established the Riksbank Prize in Economics in memory of Alfred Nobel in 1967-68. And a few years later, Friedman got the prize. I never met Åsbrink again, but in case I'd met him, I would like to have asked him about his feelings, because I never met someone who was so strongly against Friedman. Anyway, I was also told that there are 3 interesting reports in the archives, but I couldn't get hold of them. I had to wait at least 8 years. Then I made an application, it was turned down, and then I made another application after Åsbrink had left. That was accepted. I got the copies, only the copies, nothing else. And I wrote a short paper in English. Mike Bordo helped me at that time. It was published in an obscure journal in economic history in Lund, now defunct, and everything was forgotten about it. But this was before inflation targeting. Now with inflation targeting, I've returned to it. I have full access to the Riksbank archives, and I have found recently a lot of papers that are just fascinating, at least for me, with my interest in monetary policy and monetary history. So now, here's the questionnaire that Heckscher and Root set up. There are three sections. First of all, which should be the rule for monetary policy? The second section is, which are the proper instruments for monetary policy under a free currency, that's under a paper standard? And the third section is, which other issues should be considered for the paper standard? And the first question is, which should be the international prerequisites for tying the Swedish krona to the monetary systems of other countries? And the conclusion was, Sweden should not enter international cooperation until the world monetary system is well organized. In the meantime, Sweden should maintain a free currency, that is a paper standard. Question 1B is, what are the arguments for tying the krona to the international currencies? To tying it to the gold standard or to a particular foreign currency? And the answer was, just wait. It will take a long time before there is an international system that works, but you might consider the British pound if Britain could find a proper solution to its monetary problems. Davidson was upset. He said, avoid the pound. The British don't know how to run monetary policy. They have proved that since they entered the gold standard at the wrong exchange rate. Question 1C and D was, what are dealt with the basic principles to guide the transition to a fixed exchange rate? Should Sweden go back to the old parity or to the market rate? And the answer was, any return to a fixed exchange rate should take place at the going rate. Don't try to go back to some other parity. And should the transition to a new fixed rate be temporary or permanent? And the economist said, it should be taken in one permanent step. Yes?
So, in the modern discussion of gold standard and going back on, it isn't just an obvious, you always go back at the depreciated rate. There's a view that during a war or an emergency, you inflate and then you go back at the going rate, even though it's painful, because that establishes your credibility to print money and borrow more effectively in the next war. So it's not obvious. It's like all things, you pay some price today, but you gain credibility to borrow again tomorrow. Did they talk about this at all? Or
yes, they talked about it for 6-7 years, between 1914 and 1922. And they settled that issue. And it was an extremely lively debate. And because all the economists, Cassel, Heckscher, even Ullin, and Wicksell were involved with the Riksbank. And the Riksbank sent Wicksell to England, to Vienna, and to Berlin to figure out what kind of policy we should carry out. Wicksell met with this young guy, Keynes, and he looked upon Keynes and tried to convince him about the role of price stability. But he felt that he didn't manage to convince Keynes at that time. Right? So all the issues you raised, they were dealt with earlier. And now, in 1931, no one thought about going back at any old parity, because the cost to society in terms of unemployment was just too high.
Right, but Lars, getting on to John Cochrane's point, so I did this paper with Finn Kidlin a while ago, called the gold standard as a rule. But if you take the modern theory of time consistency, okay, there's a really good argument to go back to a rule which was around for like hundreds of years. So I think that I wonder if these people thought about those issues. I mean, because they seem to see things in very black and white terms. But this story, the modern approach would maybe say they should have gone back to gold at the original parity.
In the next version, I consider this issue in more depth, but I haven't seen any discussion by Heckscher and Cassel on this issue. And I think you have to look upon Sweden as a small open economy, borrowing from abroad, not having a big domestic financial market or capital market. So that they were not dealing with the issue of creditors and debtors losing or gaining money. But it could be something I could look for.
And not even the government. I mean, usual argument this is that, why did Hamilton repay the American debt when he didn't have to? Well, he bought credibility to borrow again. Why did the English go back on pre-war parity so they get the credit to borrow again? But that only happens if you fight wars. If you sit up there and don't fight wars, you don't need the credit, I guess.
But they were neutral. But the reasons that they left the gold standard was because of the war. They were part of the story.
David Laidler has a question.
Yes, David.
Just one remark about the British literature. Don't forget the Cunliffe Commission took Britain back to the pre-war parity precisely on the grounds of the credibility. And the Swedes were in that argument. The other thing to remember is that David Ricardo considered the question of whether Britain should go back to gold at the pre-1797 parity at great length before the restoration of 1821. And Ricardo's work was actively discussed in the 1920s in the run-up to the restoration of the gold standard in the UK. So this wasn't just a Swedish debate. But Lars is right. It had been discussed, and arguments about credibility had been discredited by the experience in Britain after 1926.
Yeah. Thank you. So now to question 1A, the rule for a paper standard. What rule should guide the discount policy and the exchange rate policy of the Riksbank under a paper standard? And the answer was the rule should be stabilizing the domestic purchasing power of the krona. That was Heckscher and Cassel's view. Heckscher said we should follow Wicksell's rule. Cassel said, let's follow Davidson's rule. And Davidson said that he was unclear. He couldn't give a correct, he couldn't give a simple answer. He wanted the best conditions for business activity should be the rule, but never gave it operational meaning. And then we should look upon what happened to prices before 1931. Wholesale prices in Sweden dropped sharply due to the world deflation between 1928 and to 1931. And while the cost of living remained fairly stable compared to wholesale prices. And here we have the question, which choice of price index should be adopted for the stability of the domestic price level? And the Riksbank gave 5 options: wholesale prices, retail prices, cost of living, import prices, or export prices, or any other way. Heckscher answered, the prices of domestically produced goods should be stabilized. Cassel said, the relationship is not normal between wholesale prices and consumer prices, but in due course, the Riksbank should stabilize consumer price index. And Davidson replied, every kind of index should be studied since so little was presently known about this issue. How often should the price index be collected? Cassel gave an answer. We need weekly data. We need weekly data. And it turned out that his advice was followed by the Riksbank, which is a proper base period for price stabilization. Heckscher said October 1931 price level should be the basis. Cassel said mid-1931 cost of living should be the basis. No one wanted to go back to the price level of, say, 1928 or something like that. And then turning to the instruments, which are the instruments under a paper standard? Well, the discount rate of the Riksbank is the main instrument, just as under the gold standard. Heckscher said exceptional use of credit restrictions and deposit with the Riksbank could be used. Davidson said open market operations as used by the Fed should be adopted by the Riksbank. And he advised the Riksbank, read the annual report of the Federal Reserve to learn how to run open market operations. Yes?
Did they have, so they have a price level target?
Yeah.
Meaning, and if you go up, you come back down again. Did they have any of our current debate of an inflation target or forgetting past sins? Or did they just say, yeah, price level target, and we'll talk about what?
I'm looking for that. I'm looking for the answer. I don't have the answer yet. But so far, they never discussed what you do when you missed the target, except Lindar, where you could have a tolerance band. they only looked upon how should we, which is a proper rule for price level stabilization, which is a proper index, and how do we get there?
It sounds like price level was there, and they didn't even.
It was price level, nothing else. Is there a need for any additional powers that the Riksbank doesn't use? And Cassel and Heckscher were very clear. All
He has a
rules.
question.
Oh, sorry, Paul. Yeah.
It's right on what you're talking about now. So Irving Fisher proposed a different instrument, which was in his writing for Americans, the gold standard of the dollar.
Yeah.
The gold the gold content of the dollar. And that's dealing the problem with the problem up close. And did that idea ever cross the Atlantic?
Yes, it did. Wicksell wrote in Economics Tidskrift a critique of Fisher's views. And
Was he automatically against it?
I don't remember exactly his arguments, but he never left his views of 1898. Fisher was followed by the Swedish economists, but he was not followed in the sense that they adopted his views. So they stayed with Wicksell and with Davidson. I could bring that into the next version of the paper. It's worth commenting on. Yeah, I agree with you. So on the instrument, Cassel and Heckscher was very clear. All rules pertaining to the gold standard and to the size of the note issue should be abolished at once. The Riksbank should be free to print as much notes as they wanted. And Cassel actually had met with Ivar Krüger, and Krüger had told him a few weeks before this report that he feared for bank runs in the United States, and thus bank runs in Sweden as well. And Cassel brought this idea with him and said that the Riksbank should not be afraid of bank runs, just provide the cash necessary. And Heckscher said, public announcements about the new policy are very important. And about the exchange rate of the krona, Heckscher and Cassel said, leave the exchange rate floating for the moment. Don't try to control it. Later on, the Riksbank might carry out the policy to influence exchange rates. And then other issues raised by under question 3 was that Heckscher stated that in the future, the paper standard should be anchored in the law, like the gold standard was anchored in law. It was a difficult task because it was difficult to find the anchors to write into the law. And then Heckscher also said that the government and parliament should endorse the new rule. And about other issues, Heckscher said the Riksbank should employ a young, able economist to analyze movement in prices. And what was missing from these reports? Well, there's no mentioning of time lags. There's no mentioning of tolerance bands. There's no mentioning of fiscal policy measures, no mentions on tariffs, trades, restrictions, or exchange controls. Why is this the case? Well, they were all Wickelsians. They were classical liberals. They were open for unrestricted trade and commerce. And Heckscher's book on mercantilism was just published in Swedish, which was a book for open trade. And the world depression has not yet hit Sweden. Unemployment was not an issue. So, in November, the Political Economy Club met. That was a club with all the economists in Stockholm. They discussed a book that Cassel, Heckscher, Myrdal, they were there all. And the debate at that meeting was crucial because it opened up a difference between the young economist and the old economist. Ullin said, I think an economic council in cooperation with the sizable secretariat and Department of Economics and Statistics at the Riksbank might be important for economic policy in Sweden. Heckscher felt attacked personally and objected strongly. I think this is the last thing we should do. We should first see if we can find other ways. We could contact Hamrin and Root and write them letters and tell them what to do. An economic council will just make it difficult for us economists to reach the policymakers. Myrdal stepped in with a new argument. A council would foster economic planning. planhushållning. And this is the start of the debate in Sweden about central planning. The council should have a secretariat working with the statistical department at the Riksbank. The Riksbank needs such a department because we have to synchronize policies that emerged under the new paper standards. During the gold standard, it was sufficient to look at, I quote from Myrdal, the stock of notes, the gold reserve, and the discount rate. That was all. That was monetary policy. Now, Myrdal sees an opening for a different type of stabilization policy. You have to coordinate price stabilization with other government policies, with unemployment policy, fiscal policy, tariff policies. And I found, I should have told you, by pure chance, I happened to run into a word-by-word account in the archives of Heckscher of this meeting, 40 pages, where they tell exactly what Hammarskjöld said, what Ohlin said, and Myrdal said. And it was fascinating to have this opening back in time and see how they was thinking. And Ohlin supported Myrdal. He said, I must argue against Heckscher. If some economists were employed to prepare policy advice, they could do so better than we professors who only write our scientific studies and are busy with our teaching. We can still take initiatives like Heckscher, but Heckscher is not always at the disposal to push with no limits for new initiatives. I think that Sweden have had far too much of professors who manage everything and too little of young economists who specializing on certain tasks. I cannot imagine that this would prevent Roth from having daily conferences with Heckscher about currency issues. And Heckscher fired back. He was so upset. You have to distinguish between two tasks for economic council. One to run a planned economy, one to be advisor to policymakers. And if despotism, that is a planned economy, is introduced in our country, of course, there is a need for more information than if not. And he ended up, we have to separate the two different roles. If this is done, I will be happy, but I must reserve the right to present the drawbacks of the argument. So that ended the attempt by the economic professions to write one book. So instead, we got two books. Yeah.
Lars, this feeds into the old debate about rules and discretion, right? I mean, Milton Friedman said, you want to have an automatic rule, you don't want to have a council, you don't want to have all this stuff going. Simple rule, and it just works. Okay, and so this is what the debate's about, because they're saying, look, no, we need people, because now we're on a paper standard. We need to have people, we have all these issues to deal with. And of course, that's exactly what Friedman would have been against.
Yeah. So Heckscher, he worked hard. He published 1 month later, Sveriges penningpolitik, which basically was the same book message as in his report to the Riksbank. It was 179 pages with a classical liberal view. Monetary policy should focus on one issue, price level stabilization. Gunnar Myrdal published Sveriges väg genom penningkrisen, a book that is novel in the sense that he has a different message. We need more central planning. Fiscal policy should be made more expansionary. The idea of a balanced budget should be abolished. The Riksbank, the government, the workers and employers have a deal to make. Free competition is dying. We should free us from the old liberal democratic fiction that only government authorities should exercise executive power. The social partners and the state should cooperate for successful monetary policy. And I was amazed when I read this, because here you have actually the start of the end of price level stabilization as a policy tool, and the foundation for the Riksbank policy in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Myrdal's approach ruled Swedish monetary policy from the early 1950s to the end of, until financial deregulation of the 1980s. Then, in the coming years, 1932 and 1993, there were some action by the government and the Riksdag that stabilized or entrenched the monetary rule into the running of the monetary policy. I have to rush. What happened then with the reports? Well, the most important result was that a weekly price index of the Riksbank was published every month. And the Riksbank, the price index was given with 2 decimal points. 2 decimal points. And there is an oral tradition, an anecdote I learned from my old professors, that Erik Lindahl, he was ready to go up to the Riksbank and tell the root, the manager, to change monetary policy if the 2nd decimal point of the consumer price index had moved. I mean, that's a belief in monetary targeting, or in fine-tuning, I would say. So here's the consumer price index of the Riksbank. It remained stable throughout the 1930s. And how did the economists look upon it? Well, I quote.
What I have a question.
Yeah, please, sorry.
So Lars, you know, when you published this article back in the, whatever it was, in the 90s,
Yeah.
and there was a whole debate about this. And what some people argued was that, wait a minute, yes, they're price level target, but what are they really shadowing the British pound? Okay, and so if you look at that index you've got, but you also put prices in the UK, you will see that they move very close together. So in terms of after the fact, when you look at it, yeah, they're price level, but they're kind of shadowing the gold standard. The Britain's not the gold standard either, but they are shadowing a large open economy.
Yeah, I will make that point in the next version, because the krona was tied to the British pound in July 1933. And there's no explanation in the archives why. The only explanation I've heard is that the guy who was in charge of the exchange rate notes, he went on vacation. So they just stopped there. And that's not a good explanation. John?
So you have that flat price level.
Yeah.
Did they, and I guess, so the regime was raise interest rates if price levels are high and lower them if they're low. Did they actually change interest rates, or then you said they pegged to the pound? What did they actually do?
Yeah.
They didn't do much of monetary policy. I would try to deal with that in the next version, because in 1937, the British price level increased. And there was a debate where Heckscher and Cassel said, we have to appreciate the Swedish krona in order to maintain stable domestic prices. But that Minister of Finance objected, so they just kept the peg to the.
So they were pegged to the pound.
Yeah.
So it was basically just talk about a price level target then, right?
Well, it was consistent, because
the
as
debate.
long as the British had a stable price level,
Well,
the
then-
Sweden imported the stable price level.
So in many ways, this is like the inflation targeting experience in the 1990s,
Yep.
where there's all this talk about, oh, this will free central banks to really hammer interest rates up and down. We go, inflation does nothing, central banks don't do anything, and that was that.
Yep.
Yeah, so, I mean, so you need to look at all of this, because otherwise this could just be good luck, right? If they're not having to do anything with interest rates and those sorts of things.
Expectations.
There was not much of it. So the big debate in Sweden was in 1931, in October, November, and December. And there was some debate afterwards, but not much. And as long as the British price level was stable, the Swedish level remained stable. So I'm sorry, Shaman, that I'm not following the rules.
Okay.
Thank you. Ulrich Fischer was most enthusiastic about the Swedish monetary program. He argued that the Swedish experiment is the most important landmark up to this time in the history of stabilization. And if you look upon his correspondence, he sent letters to Roosevelt, even with charts on the Swedish consumer price level, trying to convince him that Sweden could do a good, the United States could do a good job. Lindahl, he was in Sweden. Oh, sorry, Bob.
This you gave me a chance to actually read this whole slide, and it commends Sweden for achieving price stability, but it doesn't talk about Fisher's central idea of stabilizing the dollar by having an automatic feedback rule that made the gold content of the dollar rise and fall as necessary to achieve close to price constancy. And so this is way less than half of Fisher's contribution to just be a champion of price stability. He had a very well thought through, effective way of achieving price level, way better than fooling around with interest rates. Under Fisher's regime, you get very close to exact price stability without having to worry about interest rates at all.
Well, the Fisher approach did not attract the Swedish economists in the 1930s.
Didn't attract American economists either, except me.
So Lindahl, he remained throughout his life a strong proponent of price stabilization. He said that the lesson is a clearly defined goal for the central bank should be established and the monetary policy should be based on price index. The young Bertil Ohlin, he published an article in 1933, the insufficiency of price stabilization. It's not sufficient to stabilize prices, we have to stabilize employment. And in 1937, he compared price stability to full employment as two goals for monetary for economic policy, and he advocated full employment by steering investments via the rate of interest and public investments. And his view became actually the view of Swedish economists in the post-World War II.
Was there any buildup of public debt in the 30s or not?
Hardly any.
Okay, so they never had to deal with that issue.
No.
Makes life easier.
There is an interesting case where Sweden became, I think, one of the first countries with an expansionary fiscal policy based on the program or theory that Myrdal wrote for the Ministry of Finance in 1933, arguing why we should not stabilize the budget over 1 year, but over the business cycle. So what ended price stabilization? Well, unemployment became the burning social issue in the 1930s. The economists moved to policies to reduce unemployment. World War II brought exchange controls. The monetary program in 1944 established Davidson's rules combined with full employment. The Labour Party program for the World War II was written by Gunnar Myrdal to some extent, and he recommended government controls over interest rates and investments. The Bretton Woods system, through the control of exchange rate, allowed financial repression, and the Riksbank lost its independence and was turned to an office under the Ministry of Finance. So this was the reason why we lost an interest in price level stabilization. And why did inflation targeting, that is price stability, return in the 1990s? First of all, the financial deregulation of the 1980s, the end of the pegged exchange as a krona by the financial crisis in 1992. Inflation targeting emerged as an alternative in the Swedish debate. It was imported from Bank of Canada. It was not taken from from Wicksell and the Swedish history. The Riksbank took the initiative for inflation targeting and not the government. And the chief economic advisor of the prime minister, that was me, I wrote a number of reports for the prime minister saying, let's just prepare for a floating exchange rate and introduce a monetary rule. I was asked to be silent because the Riksbank had heard about my reports and they sent it to Lund, because if that would leak, it could cause a speculation against the krona. So it was not the government that took the initiative for inflation targeting in 1992, it was the Riksbank eventually. So my last slide, the end of monetary history. The three economists, Cassel, Heckscher, and Davidson, they prepared the first practical guide for inflation targeting in 1931. I'm claiming it's still a useful guide. There is so much in it that are relevant for the understanding of monetary policy today. And Wicksell's theory is still the theory of central bank policy across the world. There's no alternative yet. And the Swedish monetary history demonstrates which factors can determine the end of inflation targeting, price level targeting. That is a new burning social issue, a new war, new controls, a new way of dealing with an emergency. So let's hope we have a peaceful future with freely working financial markets, which are prerequisites for Wicksell's rule. And then the Swedes will run world monetary policy intellectually for the next 100 years. Thank you.
Just a very short comment. In the 1960s, when Hong Kong was still a British colony, they had a financial secretary, a finance minister, John Cowperthwaite, and he adamantly refused to allow the collection of any kind of economic statistics of any sort, any financial statistics, because he feared they would be used to impose planning on the economy. And this was in opposition to what Britain was doing at the time, which was controlling everything.
Yeah.
His successor changed the policy. But so for a period of 10 years, all he did was look at the daily cash flow of the revenue. And he figured he could tell from the revenue flow the health of the economy. And that's the only thing he looked at in his role as finance minister of the country. Anyway, a 10-year experiment.
In 1937, Sweden got Konjunkturinstitutet, the Business Cycle Institute, set up by Dag Hammarskjöld. And that institute was actually a reflection of the idea of an economic council suggested by Myrdal and Ullin in 1931. So there's a history. I deal with that in the paper.
I want to get back to the price stabilization rule, okay, how successful it really was. Okay, because if they're pegging to the British pound, and it looked pretty good, that figure you showed, but that's not because they are following the rule, it's because they're pegged to the pound. And the British in this period, after they leave the gold standard and after a couple of years, they did pretty well in that pre-World War II period. So in a sense, what really happened was you're tied to Britain, and Britain is doing a good job. It's like Canada's tied to the US, and the US is doing a good job. And so it's like, it gets back to Bob Hall's point, which is if they were really filing a price stability policy, that they may not have shadowed the British price level perfectly. So the counterfactual would be, what if they did run, okay, a price stabilization policy, price level target, exactly, and that's all they focused on, and hold constant the fact that Britain's out there. Okay, how would they have done? That's the counterfactual that I'd like to see.
Well, I would say that Sweden had a full program of price level stabilization between, say, September 1931 to July 1933. That was a true period with a floating exchange rate. And then we had a pegged exchange rate until 1939. Well, we had it from then on. But we used, I would argue that the Swedes used the credibility, or they used the monetary policy of Britain to maintain domestic price stability. But whenever there was a tendency for the British price level to move outside this band, there was a debate in Sweden. What should we do?
But did they do anything?
They set up a government investigation.
Yeah, but
And the Minister of Finance, Ernst Wigforss, he argued that it was good to have a little bit more inflation from the UK because that would decrease unemployment in Sweden.
okay.
There is one country that has adopted a price level stabilization that has worked extremely well by having a dual currency, and that's Chile. So Chile has two currencies, the peso, which is managed in a standard way and loses value on a trend and has all the problems. And then the price level stabilized unit, the Unidad de Fomento, is defined as enough pesos to buy the cost of living bundle. So its price is exactly purchasing power constant. And that's been a success. It was installed by the Chicago boys under Pinochet, but it's currently under some threat, as I understand it, but it's still working. And there you're getting the price level in there perfectly, and it's very influential. but no country has ever learned about it. No economist has ever learned about it, except Bob Schiller and me. But otherwise, you'll find no mention of this anywhere. But it works. It's in the real world and it works.
Bob, is it a monetary policy or is it a very simple device for inflation indexing contracts?
It's the second. The way it works.
That's what I thought. Okay.
The way it works is there's a standard monthly cost of living survey. It generates a number, which is the number of pesos in the cost of living bundle. How much does that bundle cost that month? And then that number is published. It's turned into a sliding number anticipating movements to try to get as little noise as possible. And that's been successful. That was, by the way, a problem that Fisher solved in his book about price level stabilization.
But Fisher saw it as a monetary policy, not just as here's a handy indexation scheme.
Oh, no, his policy would make the dollar a price level stabilized instrument.
Right.
It's just, you define, the under his regime, the only thing that in the monetary sphere that the government would do would be to present a number. And the number is the number of ounces of gold that will buy the cost of living bundle. That's it. That's it. Then you have a price level stabilized price. Whether it's a good idea or not, is.
But Bob Hall had a paper in 1984 when there was a whole debate about 1982 on the gold standard. It was in Brookings, right? And he came up with
it's National Bureau.
Was it?
National Bureau.
Yeah.
It was NBER.
NBR. And what he did was he took Fisher's idea and he came up with his own, basket called an ANCAP. But in a sense, it did pretty well for a while, right?
No, it collapsed right away. It was a complete disaster.
With aluminum.
It taught me a lot about policy design. But Ricardo Haitian, I have a couple of papers on this. Instead of using a commodity and say it's certain that it's enough of the commodity to buy the cost of living bundle, it's better to make it a security. So it is possible to have a single currency that is price level stabilized. Again, there's questions about whether macroeconomic performance is any good. We don't have any good answer to that. The Chilean system dodges that problem.
Wait, how do you have a single currency that's price level stabilized?
Pardon me?
How do you have a single currency
You
that's
have
price
to read the paper.
Which one has this sticky prices? So Francois Velde found that the livre were sticky and the écu were not. In Chile, is the unidad de fomento the sticky price, or is the pesos the sticky price?
Well, define sticky for this purpose.
Which one has output effects associated with inflation?
Oh, well, any.
I'm getting us off track
any
because Bob
solution-
Ross is so fascinating.
Any solution that's indexes the monetary unit to one thing it has some possibility of having too large a response to a monetary shock or a macro shock.
Taylor, John.
So
I have a question about your title. It's called The First Practical Guide to Price Level Stabilization. I haven't heard a practical guide. I haven't, what are you proposing? What's the second? I don't know. What do you, is it just 2% target, 0%, 1%? What do you do?
Well, they suggested that the price level should be 0. And then they discussed how can the Riksbank carry out this policy? Which are the instruments? Which are the issues they should deal with? How should the legislation be adjusted to price level stabilization? Which should be the base period? When you read through these reports, about 60, 70 pages, you can read them as guides.
Excellent.
How to deal with, how to set up a program of price levels and be successful.
But it doesn't sound like they came to an agreement about that practical. Do we raise interest rates? Do we change the exchange rate? Do we change the gold content of the krona? They talked about it, but they didn't really come to agreement.
Well, each report was written by every individual. They didn't cooperate among themselves. And it's a fascinating thing is that they managed to 3 weeks, in 3 weeks, to write each a report. But when you read the reports together, there's a main message. There's a common thread, common recommendations. There are no major differences in opinion among them.
Except for what should we do about it, right? So if the price, we want to target the price level, suppose the price level goes up. So
Well,
what do we do about it?
They didn't discuss that case. They just discussed
Or
which
go down?
price level, which price index should we choose, and which instruments should we use, which base period should we use, how often should we measure the price index.
But did they agree on what instruments to use?
Yes, absolutely. They were all in agreement that we should use the discount rate of the Riksbank. That was the main instrument, just as under the gold standard. So when you read the papers, when you read the reports, it's surprising to me how close they are to each other. And they were known to have debates. I mean, Cassel and Heckscher didn't like each other. Davidson and Heckscher didn't like each other. So still, they had this common view. And they were more common if you have pick 3 American monetary theories today and ask them to write each a separate report on how should US monetary policy be carried out. I guess there were more divergences today than there were at that time. That was counterfactual, but I don't know how to run it. Yeah.
But Myrdal wanted a totally different economic system, so how would that fit?
Myrdal was not contacted by the Riksbank. He was not invited to give his views. He entered afterwards, a month later. And his ideas, they were different from Cassel, Heckscher, and Heckscher, Cassel, and Davidson. Cassel, Heckscher, and Davidson, they were the old guard. They were the first generation of modern economists in Sweden, and they had the same background. Ohlin and Myrdal, they represented the second generation, and they were more activist. They were more pro-fiscal policy, more for government intervention. So there was a distinction between the old and the new generation. But the Riksbank only asked the old generation.
I think Sweden is credited with the first state system of banknotes in mid-17th century.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if that's like a pure coincidence, or maybe this history of early monetary thought goes further.
It's a transaction cost explanation, because the Sweden was on a copper standard, and the copper coins were so heavy you could mostly transport them by sleigh on snow in the wintertime. So it was much easier to write promissory notes. And that's why we got Riksbank notes. And since then, the idea of notes have been very strongly, say, entrenched in Swedish monetary thinking. We were on the gold standard, we were on silver standard, but no gold coins, no silver coins were used at all, because everything was dealt with through notes, Riksbank notes or private bank notes.
So when you say price level stabilization, I'm thinking it's not 1% inflation, not 2%,
Yeah.
it's
Zero.
That's, you think that's a better system than 1%? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that in 1931, price level stabilization emerged as the goal of monetary policy.
Yes.
When I first time I wrote myself on this issue, that was in 1978 in Swedish public debate, I suggested an inflation target zone between 0 and 2%. But that was in the heyday of Keynesianism in Sweden with a fixed exchange rate. So it was just purely an academic exercise. But 12 years later, Sweden actually got inflation targeting. but the target was 2% plus minus 1%.
But to answer John, in the
Yeah.
historical context, isn't it what's important that whether it's 1% or zero,
Yeah.
what's important is that the central bank uses a discount rate to do either an inflation target or a price level target, as opposed to specifying a rule. Gold content shall be X, exchange rate peg shall be Y, that this is a central bank authority in the first place, that the price level, US didn't even have a central bank. Price level was whatever it is. So that's what's new and interesting about it, right? As opposed to price level versus inflation rate targeting.
The new thing was that the Riksbank was ordered to have a monetary rule aiming at price level stabilization. That was how it was specified in the government decision of September 27th. So they announced this is the rule that the Riksbank should follow, and then gave it. Then the Riksbank was ordered to follow this rule.
But I think what really the real key takeaway here is they set up a framework for price stability. They didn't actually do it because they ended up just pegging to the pound. They did it for 1 year. So it's not what happened, but it's how they posed the problem. I mean, and the questions that they raised, which were really very modern. That I think is the contribution to this paper.
It's the intellectual discovery, the intellectual framework that's important here.
Yeah.
Because they are just imagine you start on a new rule, you start on a new behavior, then you have to explain how would you set up the institutional framework, how should you set up the rules, the instruments, everything, the legislation. And that was, say, the pioneering contribution of 1931. Mike reads me better than I do myself.
I sort of asked this question before, but economists were terrible in predicting the inflation of 2022. They weren't even close. A little better in 2023. And so they started the year, we've got it under control. It's coming down. 3 rate cuts, 4 rate cuts, 3 rate cuts. And so now we're earning maybe no rate cuts. So how does everybody get it wrong all the time so often? I mean, what is it about the business of the monetary policy industrial complex, if I create those words, that keeps getting the inflation wrong? And of course, if they can't get that right, you can't predict 10-year budgets, can't predict anything. I mean, they can't even get that right. And they want to go on with every other possible legal arrangement you have. Now, I don't know if you've thought about this, but I mean, you're part of the monetary policy industrial complex. So why don't, like Queen Elizabeth walked into LSE, why didn't you guys see this coming? So I'm asking, why don't you guys get this right? I mean, or better yet, why do you always get it wrong and by a lot? Could you explain that, Colonel Jessup?
Well, I can explain it in the Swedish context because I'm now outside the monetary complex, but I see the problems or the weaknesses of the Swedish way of carrying out inflation targeting. They have been just too short-sighted. They have used the wrong models. They have been too interested in making experiments. But the question is probably to John Taylor and Mike Bordo and the US economists here. Why?
No, I'm asking just as a general philosophy of the predictions of economists, monetary specialists.
I would like to answer it the following way. Policymakers do experiments all the time. Sweden is unique. There's no country in the world, I would claim, that has experimented with so many types of fiscal and monetary policies in the past 100 years. And I don't know why, but this has been our tradition. We always try to be better and better. And trying to be better and better, of course, you make failures all the time, but you learn, you adjust.
They do learn.
They do learn,
David has a
at
question.
least for the short run. Yeah.
David Laidler has a question.
That was a long time ago. I just wanted to add to what Mike Bordo said about the contribution to this paper. This was a plan for price stability under a fiat currency when the gold standard had broken down. Wicksell had proposed getting rid of gold in 1898 because all gold did was tell central banks what to do with the interest rate. So why didn't central banks just look at the price level and do it at the interest rate and forget about gold? So it was a major intellectual advance in thinking about monetary policy. Could I just add one addendum about Irving Fisher's compensated dollar while I'm at it? The QJE actually rejected Knut Wicksell's critique of the compensated dollar scheme. Like Lars, I can't remember the content of that, but it was Lars who sent me a copy of this correspondence 20 years ago, and we had a good laugh over it at the time. I won't say any more than that. Oh yeah, I will say one more thing. The compensated dollar, if you want to find it, go to the Economic Journal in 1891, and you'll find an article by Neuron Williams, which Irving Fisher eventually acknowledged.
Thank you, David.
That's it. Okay, thank you.